Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Barbara Valtskova, and I am a postdoctoral fellow at the Center on Asia and Globalization at the Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy. And I'll be serving as a moderator for today's Counterpoint Southeast Asia panel discussion. For those of you joining us for the first time, Counterpoint Southeast Asia is a panel discussion and policy brief series that addresses questions of strategic significance to Southeast Asia by putting together diverse perspectives from invited experts from the region. Each issue of Counterpoint tackles a crucial topic, and today specifically we are addressing the question of how should Southeast Asia strengthen its economic security in the face of current geopolitical challenges. As you know, Southeast Asia's economic security is increasingly challenged by US-China rivalry, which fragments global supply chains and undermines ASEAN's emphasis on cooperation. Rapid digital transformation, climate change, and the renewed US protectionism under President Trump further complicates the region's export-driven economies and overall stability. As ASEAN navigates this complex environment, the question is about how should we maybe redefine the concept of economic security to align with today's geo-economic realities? And also, can ASEAN maintain its relevance or aspiration as a champion of regional economic security? To help us address these questions today, we have invited 4 speakers, and they will each have about 8 to 10 minutes to present their key arguments. And after all speakers finish with their presentations, we will open the floor to questions and discussion. So, and also, important point, we apply Chatham House rules. So please, if you would like to quote any of the speakers, you can ask them after the discussion. So with these points in mind, I'll proceed to briefly introduce the speakers in the order in which they will present. And these are only brief introductions for their full impressive profiles. You can refer to their biographies at the CAG website. To begin with, we have Dr. Dennis Hu, who is a senior research fellow at the Center on Asia and Globalization at the Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy. Previously, Dennis was the director of the APEC Policy Support Unit from 2011 to 2022. Our second speaker is Ms. Joanne Lin, who is a senior fellow and co-coordinator of the ASEAN Studies Center at ACIA's Yusof Ishak Institute in Singapore. She previously served at the ASEAN Secretariat from 2015 to 2021 and was head of the External Relations Division under the ASEAN Political Security Community Department. Then we have Ms. Katrin Koh, who is a senior economist in the Regional Sovereigns team at the ASEAN Plus 3 Macroeconomic Research Office, AMRO. Prior to joining AMRO, Katrin was a senior economist in Bank Negara, Malaysia. And last but not least, we have Dr. Pasha Xie, who is Jean Monnet Chair Professor at the Singapore Management University, Yong Pong House School of Law. Prior to academia, he was a legal affairs officer at the WTO Appellate Body Secretariat and an associate at Sherman & Sterling LLP. So we have a great lineup with us today, and let's start with Dennis. Dennis, the floor is yours.
Thank you, and good afternoon to all of you. What I'd like to do for the next 8 minutes, right, is in my case, I'm just going to touch a little bit on the concept of economic security and the approach that ASEAN has taken for the last couple of decades, and why I think it's time for the region to kind of rethink or revisit this whole approach that they've taken. So, first question is, what is economic security? If you take the sort of the realist approach to it, which I'm sure there's some international relations as well, it's all about economic power. It's about power and the balance between economic power and national security, right? And there's a strong focus on the issue of self-sufficiency or self-reliance, right? Making sure that you benefit more than the other. It sounds a bit familiar to you, given the current things that are going on. The other, of course, is the one that ASEAN taking is the neoliberal approach, right? Which emphasizes deep economic cooperation among its members and increasing interdependence as a mechanism to reduce risk of conflict among its various members. Right? And then we have more recently the concept of human security. Well, not too recent. The seminal report was by UNDP in 1994, which shifts the approach from the state to individuals and communities, promoting the two main, I guess you could call it the main tenets of security for them, which is the freedom from want and the freedom from fear. So in that sense, I think, to me, economic security really means different things to different actors or different people, right? From the individual point of view, what do you want? You want, I guess, a greater demand for freedom to conduct your, whether it's social or economic activities, and also have to have the capacity and resources to do it. Of course, at the national level, you take the neoliberal approach, you're trying to create a business-friendly environment to have easier access for its people in terms of public services, social protection, and in many countries, we do have the fiscal space, a good national pension scheme, like in Singapore, we have the CPF, right? At the regional level, that's when we start to look at things like ASEAN and other kinds of regional organizations, including the EU, for example. Then the focus is on that regional cooperation, integration, sustainable growth, equitable development, and trying to essentially facilitate that greater trade and investment across borders, right? And then, of course, at the much more global level, and this is where we look at institutions like the IMF, the World Bank, WTO, where you're looking at macroeconomic stability for the world economy, trying to minimize the kind of geo-economic or other kinds of systemic risks from external shocks that will have an impact on individual economies and on regions as a whole. So within ASEAN, so ASEAN is, as many of you know, is the regional grouping among all the 10 Southeast Asian member states, right? And they have basically pursued a kind of a very homegrown, organic approach to economic security, which tends to align more closer to the neoliberal approach to economic security, where there's a greater emphasis on regional economic cooperation, and of course, the last 20 plus years, deeper regional economic integration. And the underlying logic, as I mentioned earlier, is the deeper the economic interdependence among states, the higher the economic cost of conflict and the greater the incentive for peace. So let's make money and not war. I think that's, if you want to put it crudely. And the flagship for this strategy would be the ASEAN Economic Community, which was launched more than 20 years ago. And just at the recent ASEAN Summit in Kuala Lumpur, Malaysia, they just unveiled a new strategic plan for the AEC, like 2026 to 2020. And I'll touch a little bit about that, but some of my fellow panelists will also talk a bit more about that. And there are building blocks and different kinds of economic agreements that support that strategy to realize an economic community. The general idea is to create a single market and production base, and you've got various trade agreements like the ASEAN Trade and Goods Agreement, the ASEAN Comprehensive Investment Agreement, and the various kinds of FTAs, ASEAN plus one FTA, we call it, with its major dialogue partners, which currently is going through an upgrade. I think the one with ASEAN China has just been upgraded quite recently, right? And then, of course, we've got this mega free trade agreement called the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership Agreement, RCEP, which includes both China, Japan, Korea, and also Australia and New Zealand. It's the biggest free trade agreement in the world right now. And that was just started to be enforced 2 years ago. And it's still going through the process of implementation. So that's that, right? Well, we know that the world has changed quite dramatically thanks to President Trump. Right? I worked in APEC for many years. Some of you may know me from my APEC days, and so I lived through APEC 1.0, version 1.0. But version 2.0, when we talk about is dramatically very different. And I think what's very clear is that, particularly after his Liberation Day, right, on 2nd April, where he announced the sort of flurry of reciprocal tariffs on over so many countries, many of them, all of them actually, including Southeast Asian countries, we're beginning to see that the whole economic order has profoundly changed. And I think that's also undermined decades of building up of multilateral institutions, which the US has played a very important role to build up, right? I won't go into too much details about these tariffs, except the fact that it's hard. Many of the Southeast Asian countries are hard hit, particularly Cambodia, Vietnam. These are over 40% in terms of their reciprocal tariffs. And right now, we know that we're going through a 90-day reprieve until early July, I believe. And then hopefully we'll see what happens then. Of course, the main point, of course, is that tit-for-tat trade, if you want to call it trade war between the US and China, where there was the only country that did retaliate against these reciprocal tariffs has been China. It went up to, I think, it was 145% to China, and then I think from China's end it was about 125, and then on the 12th of May there was a reprieve again for 90 days. And right now they're going through talks, but it doesn't seem to be going very well. Every day it's changing, I think, we know. And then I think what Trump mentioned today that it's expecting a phone call from Xi Jinping, although if you read some of the articles like Political, he's very doubtful it's going to be a phone call, but who knows, right? Anything can happen. But right now, we know that there's a lot of economic uncertainties of what's going on. And we can read that. It's disrupting supply chains, and those are the implications for the region, right? It's amplified the various economic uncertainties, and that has deep implications on foreign investment. And why is that important for Southeast Asia? Why? Because there's a very close nexus between trade and foreign direct investment. The economic model for Southeast Asia has been to attract creating a business-friendly environment to facilitate global supply chains. And we get this full amount of foreign direct investment that come to this country. Right? Now, with this greater economic uncertainties, and multinationals have a long-term view, they don't think about tomorrow or the day after tomorrow. It's a 10, maybe 15-year view, too much uncertainty. So if you're a multinational, I'm going to stop investing for the time being. Right? So no new factories or no new kinds of development. And that has negative implications for the region. No new jobs, no new kinds of technical expertise or transfer technology, all that has been put on hold. Also, rising US-China tensions also takes a toll on ASEAN's own position, where it prides itself for its strategic neutrality. ASEAN centrality is what they call it, right? The US has played a big role in this region in terms of foreign investment. I'm Malaysian. Intel has been in Penang for the last 50 years. And when I was a kid, a million years ago, Texas Instruments used to make calculators in those days. It was just down the road where I used to live, right? But we know that China is the biggest market in the world right now, and much of its growth in terms of trade and also its linkages in supply chain has between many Southeast Asian countries to China. So ideally, ASEAN member states don't want to choose a side, right? They want to work well with both of them. There are other platforms out there that ASEAN has developed, and I think Kuan talked about it, we will talk about that, such as the ASEAN Outlook for the Indo-Pacific region. That could provide a way for the two superpowers to talk to each other. So we got all these changes. We also have pressures by the US, besides its very assertive tariff policy, greater pressure on onshoring, reshoring of all these established supply chains that have been developed for decades to move back to the US, to basically bring back jobs and domestic investments into the US. And that would have significant disruptions on supply chains. And I'm not entirely sure whether all that is possible. I think Donald Trump wants to talk about building the iPhone in the US, right? But I think in terms of pricing, it will be 3 times more expensive. From $1,000 US, it's going to be about 3,000. So is that really feasible? Who knows? So that raises the fundamental question whether ASEAN's current approach to economic security is still fit for purpose, given all these changes that we're seeing here. As I mentioned at the recent ASEAN summit in KL, I think there was joint minister statements that talked about the need to work together. I think Malaysian Prime Minister Anwar talked about some sort of coordinated approach to address many of these reciprocal tariffs. But ASEAN is not a customs union. Huh? It's not like the EU. So it's going to be very challenging for them to have that coordinated approach. And these various reciprocal tariffs, the US is looking at bilateral deals with each ASEAN member states. So I think it's going to be quite challenging for them to be able to watering it when it comes to that. But we'll wait and see how that moves forward. I think there's we've talked about it too, some sort of geo-economic task force that ASEAN has set up. Not much information about that, but I think one of the things that they should be addressing is these how to respond to a much more protectionist U.S. Trade policy. So, 1 or 2 more minutes is what's the way forward? What's the path forward given many of these changes that's been happening, right? I think it's quite clear that the whole economic rule-based order has profoundly changed. And the question is, how does ASEAN position itself in terms of economic security, trying to address many of these emerging challenges that's happening here? Also, a very key policy priority will also be to see how we can future-proof many of these existing global supply chains in the region. Right? What would we need to do to ensure that the level of disruption is less? As I mentioned, for some companies in some sectors, they spend 20, 30 years building up their supply chains. It's not so easy for you to say, I'm stopped here and move everything to the US or near the US. It's not quite possible. But having said that, there are right now a lot of disruption that's going on. Another good example is the rising US-China tensions has implications on existing supply chains. I just read an article today, maybe some of you read it, that, for example, one of the most basic antibiotics, it's amoxicillin, 80 to 90% of its raw materials is produced in China. So putting increased tariffs on pharmaceuticals or other kinds of, as a form of retaliation for China's restricting its exports of critical minerals, for example, will have global consequences, not just on security, but on other issues, health, public health, and other things, right? So these are some things that we also need to consider. And lastly, lastly, I think the strategic plan on the AEC, we haven't talked much about it. It's just been released, but so our center is planning to have in a month's time another seminar to kind of quickly assess that strategic plan to see whether it's really fit for purpose as well. Is there a sense of urgency in trying to address many of these geo-economic challenges in that strategic plan moving forward? So I think that's it. My last line is that I don't think we should abandon the existing approach to economic security in ASEAN. It's more a question of trying to recalibrate it, to fine-tune the approach to address many of these new challenges that the region is facing. I'll stop here. Thank you.
Thank you, Dennis, for explaining different approaches to economic security, establishing the urgency of the situation, and also outlining ASEAN's need to recalibrate its approach to economic security. And complementing the perspective you offered, we are now moving to Joanne. Joanne, over to you.
Yeah, thank you, Barbara. And I totally agree with you, Denise, in all your points. And I'm very glad that you actually spoke about the concept of economic security to help us to better understand, the various dimensions that are increasingly more important in the economic realm. Yeah. So in my very short 10 minutes, I'm just going to focus on 3 areas. First is how economic policies have become intertwined with the national security agenda. And secondly, the impact of Trump 2.0 tariffs, but I'm not going to duplicate what you say. And also to add on some recommendations on top of what you have already mentioned on how ASEAN can actually safeguard and strengthen its economic future. So traditionally, we know that economic and security really operates as very distinct policy domains. But of course, recent developments have sort of increasingly blurred this line, and countries are now routinely using like economic tools such as tariffs, trade and technological restrictions as like instruments to achieve national security objectives. Yeah. So President Trump's administration, for example, he has actually justified such tariffs and tech restrictions by citing national security concerns, including protecting very sensitive technologies and also domestic industries from perceived threats. Okay, and I think the perceived threats is mainly China. So just last month, the U.S. Department of Commerce has actually directed U.S. semiconductor design, software providers like Cadence and Siemens to actually halt sales, to Chinese companies. And of course, this follows, their new guidelines against the use of Huawei ASEAN AI chips anywhere in the world. But this anywhere in the world is going to be very difficult to implement, yeah? And of course, the AI diffusion rules to prevent Chinese companies from really getting very high-end chips via third countries. So these are all measures to really restrict China's advancement on the AI front. So on the economic security nexus, I also want to mention that President Trump has actually tied the US troop presence and their security obligations in Japan and South Korea to also terrorist negotiations. And I think what this reflects is really Trump's broader strategy to leverage economic policy for geopolitical objectives and, of course, vice versa. So, of course, I'm sure that will be a very big headache for Japan and South Korea to actually, separate the two out. So, similarly, China has also been using economic tools for political objectives. So, it's not the US alone that's doing that. Because, for example, if you recall, in 2020 to 2023, China has actually imposed very targeted trade restrictions on Australian products. And that includes like wine, barley, and coal following the diplomatic tensions, right? That's related to Australia's call for an independent investigation into the origin of the COVID-19 pandemic. And of course, similarly, South Korea, has also, when South Korea deployed the US THAAD, missile defense system, then China retaliated by limiting, Chinese tourism to South Korea. They have banned K-pop performance and even boycott the Korean products. And apart from all this that I have mentioned, we also see this in today's context, right? In China's bid to actually join the CPTPP. So while it's while we know that this CPTPP is actually fundamentally an economic and trade agreement, but China's application has also raised geopolitical and security concerns among members in granting China deeper economic integration, having greater market access, and all this will come with greater influence, for China, within this region. And these are all geopolitical considerations. But now I really want to turn to Southeast Asia to talk a little bit about the Trump 2.0 tariffs. But because Denise has already spoken on the impact here of that, so I want to really focus on ASEAN responses instead. So how has ASEAN actually responded to this? So ASEAN has responded by emphasizing collective diplomacy rather than retaliation. And it has opted for very measured and principle-based responses. And of course, we know that none of the ASEAN countries will have the economic weight the way that China has in retaliatory measures. So that's not definitely off the table. So last week, and Denise also mentioned, ASEAN leaders issued a joint statement raising very strong concerns about the unilateral tariff measures. And of course, reaffirming commitment to all these principles like multilateralism, rule-based trading system, WTO principles, and even like regional integration. But also, in addition, Malaysian Prime Minister Anwar, he has also wrote to President Trump to actually convene an ASEAN-US summit to directly address his concern and also to keep the diplomatic channels open, right? But, of course, the question is, will Trump agree? And I think whether Trump will agree will depend on, whether there are really compelling US interests at stake. He's really not a multilateral diplomacy person, as we all know. So now, what we can see here is really ASEAN's two-track approach. So one track is projecting collective unity, and then individual member states will also at the same time pursue their own bilateral negotiations with the US for some very sector-specific sort of a tariff adjustment. And this is very important because, each of the ASEAN countries has very different export profiles. They have a different competitive advantage and different level of sensitivity to the US tariff. So there can be no one-size-fits-all approach where the region is concerned, right? So ASEAN members will definitely need to conduct its own negotiations based on their strategic priorities and what they can realistically offer the US, whether is it tariff concessions or whether they want to purchase more US products is up to each country to decide. So the key is really to ensure that these bilateral talks will actually align broadly with the ASEAN shared principles and do not really contradict, its collective stance. But another, because I'm actually more of a security political person. So I just want to highlight another possible scenario that you might see, which is actually a strategic alignment, especially amongst countries that are severely impacted by the US tariffs, such as Cambodia, Laos, and Myanmar. And that could, potentially cause these countries to pivot even closer to China, particularly if the trade volume with the US is actually very low to begin with, like in the case of Laos. So China's growing economic influence, we can definitely see it from time to time, and it's really underscored by many things. And one is, of course, the Belt and Road initiatives that I believe at least 7 ASEAN member states or 8 ASEAN member states has actually benefited. And the other is, of course, President Xi's recent visit to 3 Southeast Asian countries, and that has really reinforced Beijing's commitment really amidst the US trade tensions. But as Denise mentioned just now, even if Southeast Asia managed to reduce the US tariffs, they will continue to face broader consequences of the US-China trade war, including some inevitable supply chains fragmentation, and of course increased geopolitical pressure to choose side amidst technology decoupling. And I think this is very interesting because I really do believe that, technology domain is actually being decoupled right now. And I also even wanted to say that education, as well. So that would definitely challenge ASEAN's traditional, neutrality and rebalancing act. So fundamentally, the uncertainties will really continue perpetually for a long time. So even right now, we are not sure whether the tariff will remain, right? Because I'm sure that you have heard that it is actually being challenged legally within the country itself by the US Court of Trade. So of course, the only predictable thing right now is unpredictability, as we have talked about. So I also want to take 2 minutes also to talk about some recommendations of how ASEAN can safeguard its future. And I think very importantly and firstly, I think ASEAN needs to deepen regional economic integration. The current intra-ASEAN trade is very low, 22%, compared to, I believe, more than 50% within the EU. So the State of Southeast Asia Survey report, which you might have seen it, that's produced by my institute, actually highlights that over 40%, of the region's respondents, they actually advocate accelerating regional integration as a response to global protectionism. But this is very easy to say, right? But it's very difficult to do because there are a lot of challenges as to integrate ASEAN into a single market and production base, as we just mentioned earlier. Why? Because I think ASEAN needs to first, address its internal competition. ASEAN countries are still competing against each other. And we need to promote complementary economic roles and product differentiation to do that. And that's a big job. And second, I wanted to advocate enhancing supply chains, but in the interest of time, and Denise has talked about it, I don't want to go into it. Third, I think ASEAN should also diversify trade partnerships. I think just last week we saw the ASEAN GCC China Summit. That I feel that is very important to strengthen the South-South cooperation. I think what is actually fundamentally most crucial is that we should not depend on any single major power or should not depend on any 1, 2, 3 major powers. We should actually work more with like-minded partners. And fourth, my point is that internal policy coordination is very important. And the geo-economic task force that Denise mentioned, it may be quite useful to align these ASEAN's economic strategies with security considerations so that we can have a more coherent responses, right, to external pressure. But I think what is also important is the prioritizing of implementation of existing ASEAN agreements. There are so many, we have lost track. Don't know whether there's thousands over or how. So anyway, Prime Minister Lawrence Wong last week also highlighted the key challenges of implementation, such as the slow removal of non-tariff barriers. So rather than introducing even more statements or even more frameworks, I think ASEAN needs to implement to achieve more tangible outcomes, such as like harmonization of standards or even more streamlined custom procedures. And finally, I think we need to invest more in human capital education and innovation. Otherwise, we will lose the region's competitiveness. So in closing, I just want to say that despite the perceptions of ASEAN being very slow and ineffective, as everybody knows, I think it holds very significant agency. So in the survey that I mentioned just now, it shows that the region actually feels that ASEAN is the top choice for championing global free trade through initiatives like the RCEP and the DIFA. We haven't talked about the DIFA, but it's an upcoming important document. So instead of depending on external groupings like the BRICS, which I don't know why half of the region wants to join it, but I think ASEAN should continue to find ways to really overcome the lack of unity and really have more coherence, right, in the building regional resilience. Yeah, I will stop here. Thank you.
Thank you, Joanne, for explaining how economic and security dimensions have become increasingly intertwined and highlighting concrete scenarios and recommendations for ASEAN going forward. And now we are moving on to our third speaker, Catherine. Catherine, please go ahead.
Hi. First of all, let me thank LKY School for having me here today and for all of you for still being here, although it's 6 p.m. on Hum Day. So I'm very grateful to be here and to share a little on my perspective. So my perspective, I'm going to come in from the economics perspective. We've heard a lot about the political considerations, the security in terms of the politics and the geopolitics for the region, as well as when it pertains to the US. Let me shift to the numbers. Let's talk about the actual economic implication. And for this, let me break this to two parts. First, I'll talk to you about the impact of the Trump tariffs, and secondly, what it actually means for the region. And over here for the region, my organization actually looks at ASEAN plus 3. For those of you who are not familiar with this grouping, that basically refers to the 10 member economies of ASEAN, plus China, Japan, and Korea. So we are part of an team that was created out of Chiang Mai Multilateralization Agreement back in 2010, right after the Asian financial crisis. It was something that was born from there and then formalized later in part of the decade. So my coverage in terms of the region is going to be ASEAN plus these 3 important trade partners that we cannot think about or neglect when we're trying to think about integration or managing this trade shock as a whole within ASEAN. So first of all, let's get straight to it. In terms of tariffs, how bad were they? Liberation Day was shocking, but since then, we've got no less than at least 5 iterations within April alone. And as of just last Wednesday, we've got 3 changes since then, right? We've got the court stopping the tariffs, next day, another court reversing it, and just today, 50% tariffs on steel. That's how fast things have been changing. But what does it really mean for the region? Let me summarize this for you. The region was hard hit. No matter which permutation you look at it, whether it is the reciprocal tariffs as announced, whether you take into account the subsequent exemptions that were given, or the subsequent acceleration of tariffs with China, the escalation and then the swift de-escalation, notwithstanding all that, the region is now in a situation where it is facing tariffs from the US at one of the highest rates it has ever seen in history. And it has happened in a very, very short time. From reciprocal tariffs to today, let me remind everybody that has been less than 2 months, or slightly over 2 months, but less than 3 months, right? So a lot of changes has already happened. And the region is one of the most hardest hit by the US. At the Liberation Day announcement, even with the exemption subsequently, the region is facing an effective tariff rate of about 22%. And that's higher than other regions, such as the EU or even India, some of the partners that we're looking at, right? So this is definitely a very big trade shock, a significant one. Now, first, there would likely be a direct impact in terms of trade channel. And secondly, this, of course, involves 2 of our largest trading partners, China and the US. And the lower global demand or lower demand overall from them would also weigh on exports for the region. Just to give a sense, together, China and the US account for about 26% of our total final demand for exports. This is not insignificant, right? And thirdly, I think this has been mentioned by both Dennis and also Joanne, uncertainty. This is the biggest issue that we're facing, right? Dennis has gone into detail about how investment decisions will be affected. And indeed, this would definitely translate into real impact, right? Companies would now think twice about investing. Decision plans might be halted, might be even cancelled altogether. If you previously had a China plus one strategy just last year, this year you might want to rethink that. Question is, you want to plus where? Plus how many? How? Right? All these things are all up in the air right now. Other impact that we would see is also this constant state of uncertainty. And we have done estimations and econometric regressions for, can only tell you so much, but even assessments just on technical terms would show you that uncertainty alone, whether or not these tariffs are eventually implemented after the 90-day pause is a separate question, but just the state of uncertainty alone would weigh on your exports, on your industrial production, and also on your GDP as a whole. And this will affect all our countries in our region, right? The other key thing to emphasize is that we're not out of this yet. Stock markets have crashed, they have recovered, but we never know what's going to happen again. And more importantly, even with the 90-day pause expiring soon, we still do not know where tariff rates are going to be. In fact, we don't even know if there are going to be any changes in the next few days, right? So very, very big uncertainty that we're facing right now, and it's affecting all facets of the economy. And that's something that we cannot emphasize enough on this. We usually make a forecast for 2 years ahead. Right now, we're having problems just forecasting even 6 months ahead. It's getting very, very difficult to have that kind of clarity in terms of where trade relations are going, where sources of growth or even risks are going to emanate from. But what does this mean for the region? Again, let me contextualize this. Is it really as daunting as it would sound? Here, I would like to offer some positive news. First of all, the region's reliance on the US as an export market has declined quite significantly in the last 2 decades. So, for example, in the early 2000s, exports to the US account for about 24% of our region's exports. Today, it accounts for about 15%. Again, this is ASEAN plus 3 as a whole. So where have all the extra exports been going to? The share has been going to ASEAN plus 3. That has increased to about 45% of our exports. Exports of final demand, on the other hand, has also increased, and it has gone significantly to China, which now accounts for 14% of our region's total exports, as opposed to US at 12%. So a lot of times when we're discussing the reliance on the US, a lot of us has a sense of like it's a very big superpower, biggest global importer in the world, right? We're thinking back of the times when goods go to the US for final consumption, and then it's just produced in the region. While the US is still an important trading market, that no longer holds absolutely true. We also have emerging final demand consumers within the region. You've got China, you've got Japan, you've got Korea, you've even got India and other markets increasing in terms of their importance as a final consumer. So that offers some breathing space and it offers a bit of hope. Ultimately, if you remember that US only accounts for 15% of total global imports, there is still 85% for the rest of the market for ASEAN plus 3 to tap on. Secondly, ASEAN plus 3 in terms of their sources of growth has also become more balanced in the sense that domestic demand has become a more important source of growth compared to say 20 years ago. So in 2005, domestic demand share of total GDP is closer to about 60%. Today, this is closer to 70% now. What does this mean? This essentially means that we're not as export reliant as we were 20 years ago, such that this kind of shocks would be something that is insurmountable or very, very difficult for the regions to deal with at that time. Right now, we have a bit more room in the sense that there is still domestic demand that will be able to support growth. And that leads me to my third point. If the domestic demand is pretty significant in terms of supporting your economy, then policy space becomes even more important because there is now more leverage in terms of the policy space. And the region, bulk of our regional members at least, would still have ample policy space to be able to support growth. Fiscal policy space and monetary policy space for majority of our member economies are assessed to be at about moderate. And this is largely due to the decline in policy space after the pandemic. But having said that, they're still at moderate. Nobody is at restrained or limited space yet to fully be able to support the economies, except for one or two economies. But for the most part of the region, most members have enough space to be able to support growth. What kind of support are we talking about? We're talking about targeted support in terms of fiscal policy, if necessary, to support growth for selected sectors that are affected. And we're also talking about the ability to support through monetary policy loosening if necessary. But again, we are also advising policymakers to wait and see and to just ensure that you have enough firepower to exercise any of this policy support if you need it, right? Again, because of the state of uncertainty that we're dealing with right now. So in the longer run, like beyond the immediate term, beyond all these measures that I've given you, what can ASEAN Plus 3 do? So some of the areas that we heard about is, increasing trade integration, increasing trade cooperation, and as Joanne rightly pointed out, these are easier said than done. It's not the easiest thing to do. But are there other rooms? So let's pivot and think about other areas, right? Most of these tariffs are now on goods. The other area that remains untapped is services trade. Services trade today accounts for about only 20% of goods trade for ASEAN Plus 3. There's definitely room to expand growth there. And secondly, the members of this ASEAN Plus 3 economies are some of the most innovative drivers in the world. There is definitely potential to promote more cross-border intra-regional investments as well, and particularly in high-tech and innovative areas. And lastly, regional cooperation is something that cannot be understated in today's world. Regional cooperation, as the ASEAN Plus 3 has formed through the CMIN, and also creating my organization, Emerald, it's a form of cooperation where they can come together and they can work out all these different areas in which they can ensure regional resilience. And this shock, if nothing else, probably have accelerated the regional integration and cooperation initiatives within the bloc. Now, let me just end with this. The ASEAN Plus 3 region as a whole has weathered through many crises. Just in the last 30 years, it's weathered through at least 3 life-defining ones, right? You've got the Asian financial crisis, you've got the global financial crisis, and you've just got the COVID-19. And they've gone through each of these crises and emerged stronger out of it. A large part of it is due to the institutional reforms that they've managed to put in place and to improve when they're confronting this crisis and when they emerge from it. So, we're cautiously optimistic that this is just another shock that the region has the ability to withstand and to weather through. With that, let me pause here. Thank you.
Thank you, Catherine, for unpacking the big uncertainty ASEAN faces, but at the same time balancing it with a reassuring perspective about ASEAN Plus 3. And finally, let me turn to our last speaker, Pasha. Pasha, please share your thoughts.
Well, thank you very much, Dennis and Barbara, for having me here. And it's a great pleasure to join this panel. Before joining academia, I worked as a legal affairs officer at the WTO Secretariat in Geneva and as a lawyer in Washington, D.C. Today, I will share some observations about legal and political challenges to ASEAN's economic security. Many of our colleagues here have already explained the geopolitical background, and I will shift the focus to the institution of ASEAN. As we know, ASEAN is set to become the world's 4th largest economy by 2030. ASEAN Center Framework have actually forged the normative integration process for what I call New Asian regionalism. And ASEAN leaders are aware that the bloc needs to ensure economic security and resilience against non-traditional threats, ranging from weaponized trade to climate change. Last week, Denise mentioned that ASEAN leaders gathered in Kuala Lumpur at the ASEAN Summit. They adopted the ASEAN Community Vision 2045 and reiterated that ASEAN's goal is to be the epicenter of growth in the Indo-Pacific region. This is in line with ASEAN's Indo-Pacific strategy outlined in the ASEAN Outlook on the Indo-Pacific, which emphasizes the concept of ASEAN centrality, which is to maintain ASEAN's central role in the evolving regional architecture. The AEC Blueprint 2025, AEC stands for ASEAN Economic Community. The Blueprint 2025 underscores resilience when facing global economic shocks and volatilities. However, security matters are allocated to the separate ASEAN Political Security Community rather than AEC, ASEAN Economic Community. This institutional divide actually hinders a streamlined response to economic security. ASEAN's recent establishment of the Special Geo-Economic Task Force in response to US measures shows the necessity for a concerted institutional effort. In the long run, ASEAN's economic security can only be safeguarded by the effective implementation of the ASEAN Community Vision 2045 to ensure seamless coordination across pillars and sectors. This is an ambitious yet important goal. As ASEAN will soon expand to 11 members, including Timor-Leste, the bloc's continued relevance depends on actively fortifying ASEAN's centrality through existing internal and external agreements and mechanisms. ASEAN's economic framework includes three important pillars. First, the AEC, ASEAN Economic Community. Second, multiple ASEAN plus one FTA. And third, RCEP. And RCEP is the largest FTA in the world by economic scale, accounting for 30% of global GDP. So let me address the AEC, ASEAN plus one FTA, and RCEP in more detail. First, what is the AEC and what are the challenges? ASEAN's supply chain resilience, first and foremost, relies on its own integration as a single market. The AEC's most notable success is creating an almost tariff-free zone. I say almost tariff-free because the tariff liberalization rate is more than 99%, but not yet 100%. However, non-tariff barriers have steadily grown up to more than 6,000 measures, such as sanitary requirements and technical standards. The existing soft law approach, such as enhancing the transparency, has not meaningfully addressed the drawback. Another important area is dispute settlement, which is key to managing economic security. In 2004, an ASEAN states concluded protocol on EDSM, Enhanced Dispute Settlement Mechanism. The EDSM simply copied and pasted the WTO dispute settlement mechanism with very minor institutions. So it looked good. Guess how many ASEAN countries have used the mechanism? The answer is 0. Yeah. Because ASEAN countries have preferred to use the WTO mechanism for solving their disputes. And I would argue that with the paralyzed WTO appellate body leading to the problem of what we call appealing into the void, the regional mechanism can provide an ideal alternative, which can be more efficient and less costly. Second, how do ASEAN plus one FTA contribute to ASEAN? ASEAN centrality is embedded in the AEC's global ASEAN agenda, which aims to keep the ASEAN plus one FTA fit for purpose for the 21st century. In 2024, the upgraded trilateral FTA, ASEAN, Australia, New Zealand FTA, came into force. The negotiations of the ASEAN-China FTA 3.0 upgrade, as well as the new ASEAN-Canada FTA, will conclude this year. So I told many American friends that they should learn from Canada. So these ASEAN plus one FTA developments are significant because they have elevated the benchmark for trade agreements. And higher level trade agreements can better ensure economic security. Finally, let me turn to the RCEP. The RCEP is probably ASEAN's most important plurilateral platform for safeguarding economic security. The RCEP includes 15 parties. It is not led by China, as many Western commentators have claimed. All RCEP parties, including China, agree that the RCEP is an ASEAN-led process. Compared to the CPTPP, the RCEP is often portrayed as a low-level agreement. And my view is that this proposition ignores the reality. Because the RCEP is used as the framework that converges consensus therefore leaving controversial areas for future implementation and negotiation. So let me give you some examples. In terms of service commitment, I think Catherine mentioned the importance of services. Many RCEP parties are obliged to transition from positive list to a more ambitious negative list scheduling. Another important area is ISDS, Investor State Dispute Settlement rules that need to be developed. And all of these need to be closely monitored. So we need a competent agency to do the monitoring work. Institutionally, the RCEP support unit was created within the ASEAN Secretariat last year. And the unit should be incrementally expanded to become an independent RCEP Secretariat. For ASEAN, its ongoing coordination and dialogue with RCEP and the CPTPP, as well as the EU and the GCC Gulf Cooperation Council, will amplify ASEAN centrality in a multipolar order. And for economic security in a broader sense, we also need to pay attention to the most cutting-edge areas, including digital trade and sustainability. Joanne mentioned DEFA, ASEAN Digital Economic Framework Agreement, which will be concluded this year. And ASEAN should also expedite what I call green regionalism. The US and EU have always focused on so-called enforcement approaches, which seek to make sustainability rules subject to dispute settlement under FTA. ASEAN should pursue market-driven mechanisms instead. Innovative examples include agreements such as New Zealand-led ACTS, Agreement on Climate Change, Trade and Sustainability, and the Australia-Singapore GEA, Green Economy Agreements. So these sectoral agreements, not FTA, these are sectoral agreements, focusing on liberalizing environmental goods and services, reforming fossil fuel subsidies, and promoting eco-labeling. The consolidations of these agreements with new digital and sustainability rules will strengthen ASEAN's economic security, and more importantly, it will enhance ASEAN's normative power in the Indo-Pacific. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Pasha, for that thought-provoking institutional analysis. So we have heard 4 insightful presentations that have emphasized the urgency of ASEAN's economic security challenges. And the presentations converge on several strategic approaches, including recalibrating ASEAN's traditional integration models, strengthening intra-regional trade and cooperation, leveraging existing frameworks, enhancing supply chain diversification, and improving institutional coordination. And now we would like to invite questions from our audience. We'll take a few questions at a time, maybe 2 or 3, before having our panelists respond. When asking a question, please kindly introduce yourself and speak clearly into the microphone so everybody can hear you. So who would like to ask the first question? Yes, please.
Oh, hello. Thank you for your time. My name is Nina. I'm currently a master's in public policy student here at the Kuan School of Public Policy. My question is really quite broad. How would these ongoing changes really change the appetite and approach of ongoing FTA negotiations? Like, for example, I'm currently looking into the ASEAN-India negotiations that they say that they will wrap up this year, but I don't think that's going to happen, but exactly my face. So things like that, would that change substantially the negotiations? Because we are also aware that inside ASEAN itself, negotiations to push agendas forward is tough. So maybe that's my question, and also how would that affect what types of stuffs are then relegated to the next phase? Like, I think it was Pasha who mentioned sustainability and digital and services then end up getting a backseat just so goods can come to the forefront, right? So maybe that's my question, as in how would it change the approach in general? Thank you.
Thank you for your question. Let's take one more question. Yes, please.
Thank you. That was really interesting. Abay from the Australian High Commission. Just interested, we talk about the concept of diversifying suppliers quite often and not being reliant on one country. I'm interested in sort of insights on how you do that in reality. Often the economies of scale of the US and China particularly mean that we gravitate towards those markets, and there's also ecosystem effects there. Joanne mentioned the sort of impediments on the Australian market from China. Our wine exports were huge there, got cut off. When the tariffs lifted, everyone flooded back in just because of the size of the market and the premium effects. So, and we had a huge diversification policy there. So I'm interested in sort of insights on how best to actually action that approach.
Thank you for the question. So we can now, maybe you can answer these questions. I don't have an order to answer. Okay, so we can take one more. Please go ahead.
Yes, good evening and thank you for your presentation. My name is W2 and I'm from the village of Singapore and West Johor. Now, my concerns would be how should Southeast Asia strengthen this economic security on a practical basis? Would a solution be that of the people in ASEAN learning to be more empathetic towards each other's respective cultures? Trump is the eternal opportunist. His policies will most likely not last beyond his term. So why are we perhaps spending too much time on Trump policies when we can use the energy to perhaps improve within ourselves in ASEAN, similar to the China approach of developing China-made tech in-house? So I see a lot of other opportunities within ASEAN that can be stirred up as a result of Trump's policies. So can we perhaps look into another angle to direct our energies? From my travels in Southeast Asia, I find that the biggest obstacle we have amongst ourselves is our lack of cultural empathy towards each other, especially towards the knowledge of the Bahasa Malay, Bahasa Indonesia, the Thai language, so on and so forth. And Singapore is the ideal location, and this could be the ideal opportunity for us to use that energy to look amongst ourselves and to improve on our inter-Southeast Asian understanding, especially in terms of the soft skills, which unfortunately, from my observation, overly efficient Singapore lacks. Thank you.
Thank you for your question. Okay, so we have 3 questions, and maybe let's start, let's go in reverse order. So Pasha, feel free to choose the question you would like to answer, or you can answer all 3 as well.
Sure. Let me address the first question. ASEAN-India FTA, this is actually quite a unique FTA. This is not recorded, right? Okay. It's always difficult to deal with India, as you may know. Okay. So India is always concerned about 2 major issues. First, agriculture, right? Very difficult. Second, India is interested in exporting its professionals, IT professionals, which other countries are not interested, right? So there's no mutual interest. India, as you may know, was a member, original member of RCEP, right? And decided to get out of the RCEP. But RCEP parties agreed to accord India special observer status, right? So that can be a platform for India to utilize. But ultimately, the decision had to be made by Indian leaders. So it's not so much ASEAN's problem, it's India's problem.
Thanks, Pasha. Maybe let me just take the second half of W2's question. That Trump wouldn't last so long, and then why would we spend so much time and energy on it? I feel that particularly personally because my life has been revolving around Trump for the last 2.5 months. Trump, in all reality, may not last too long. His next term, he's got another 4 years. But let's put it in perspective. It's just been a little over 60 days since he announced his policy, and that's just slightly more than 100 days since he took the presidency. And so much has changed. And as Dennis opened the session earlier, this is an inherent change to the global trading system. And that is why we as economists are grappling and trying to figure out where this is headed, how big is the impact, what else is going to be affected, and what are the channels that are actually going to have this impact trickle through. So for us as economists, at least, yes, it's keeping us up at night. Yes, I'm working weekends because of him. That's how big an impact it is. It's just because it inherently changes everything that all the nations have worked for in the last 100 years. We've worked towards eradicating tariffs. ASEAN, as slow as it has been moving, has also eradicated almost 100% of its tariffs. Free trade has delivered so much prosperity to a lot of countries in the world, and especially so for the small and open economies within ASEAN. We've all benefited a lot from it, from free trade for the last 100 years. And suddenly this increase in tariffs overnight shakes this very foundation that everybody has been working on. And the way that policies have been made or coming from the US administration is also very different from how it has been done previously. And that also changes a lot of things, a lot of considerations, right? As I mentioned earlier, uncertainty doesn't even begin to capture what we're actually facing, the magnitude of it. And so that's why we are particularly concerned, and that's why we are looking at it. And because, we as a region for ASEAN Plus 3, we're 30% of global trade. It's not insignificant. And if you have an inherent change to the global trading system, it's something that we definitely would want to pay more attention to. Fortunately, I wouldn't be able to comment on the second part of the question on cultural empathy, but let me just pass it on to the other speakers.
Yeah, Dennis, is there anything you would like to add?
Okay, I'll try to answer maybe 3 of them. But I was going to respond to Pasha. I mean, I was in Delhi last year, and I talked about RCEP, and I said, after 7 years of negotiation, you just walked out, right? But it's open for you to come back. The amount of pushback I got from the audience was incredible, and I think the Indian foreign minister was there too, for different reasons. So I think it's going to be tough even for the ASEAN-India negotiations to be completed so soon. But having said that, I think you would have thought the urgency is there, right? That the trading environment has become very fragmented. The WTO, again, has increasingly become it's severely weakened, almost irrelevant. So you're gravitating towards these kind of free trade agreements, FTAs, bilateral or regional. That's what's happening. But you have to remember, if you're in the Ministry of Trade, you only have very limited trade negotiators. On the one hand, you're negotiating with the US bilaterally, right? And I've been told, even on the US side, they don't have enough people. I mean, how many countries that they have imposed tariffs? Over 60, 80 countries? I think they're mainly focusing on 10 or 20. Some of them, I think in Cambodia's case, they've asked to communicate with USTR, there's no response. You just don't have enough bandwidth, right? So you can imagine, we've got only so many limited resources to negotiate. And of course, the most important, most urgent thing right now is to come up with some kind of bilateral trade deal with the US, right, to bring down those reciprocal tariffs. I think your question on diversification of supply chains, I think to answer your question is tough. I mean, it's very difficult to see how, it makes sense for multinationals, particularly post-pandemic, to diversify and reduce their dependence on a sole supplier, but not entirely, right? So you do see in certain sectors, they move some of the operations out of China to Vietnam or Malaysia, and more so recently, even Malaysia, particularly in electronic sectors and others, the infrastructure there is very good, right? So that's happening. But to entirely move your operations, I think that's going to be very, very challenging. So I don't know how this is going to play out. I mean, we talk about more onshoring to the US, but how are you going to do it? And companies have talked about the lack of skilled labor, right, in certain sectors in the US to be able to produce some of these products, right? It's going to take a long time. What I'm going to say is it takes time. It's going to take years, in fact. If you want a result tomorrow, it's not going to happen, right? And I think we're not in the best position to answer these questions. I think it's good to listen to the private sector. I think they will tell you more about this, right? How they're trying to do their best to please the US. But having said that, the cost is going to go up. Certainly, operational cost is going to go up. I think the point about economic security. Now, the thing is, right? I mean, understanding and empathizing on different members in ASEAN, I think is an important thing. I'm not quite sure whether it quite links to economic security, but I think that's an important point. I'm a Malaysian, for example, right? And I can give you an example. I think there needs to be more mobility, freer mobility of fellow ASEAN members in different countries, whether it's for cultural exchange, student exchange, and others. But it's not that easy. And in many countries, I've traveled a lot in ASEAN, there isn't even an ASEAN lane, right? And even in Malaysia now, they just opened up the biometric machines, right? But not to ASEAN countries. I only see Singapore and I think Brunei. The rest are other countries, US, Japan. There should be an ASEAN lane, right? Which you can use your passport and go through. So you don't have it, right? So I think if you want to talk about empathizing people's cultures and languages, you need to have more of that exchange, right? So yeah, that's maybe under the social cultural pillar of ASEAN, maybe we should do more. I don't know. I don't follow that aspect of it. Maybe one last point before it's more of a question, right? I'm an economist like Catherine, and if you look at the economic numbers, it does look interesting, right? Our export market to the US is declining, right? And what we need to do is to build up that economic resilience and in some ways closer integration to RCEP and others to China. But we're missing one point, right? What about the South China Sea, right? It's China may not necessarily be a benign superpower because Southeast Asia is in China's backyard, right? So as much as we want to closer integrate with China, the complication is that there are also disputes in this region, right? And that's something that we need to consider when we look at economic security. Hence the word economic security, right?
Thank you. I think I will touch a little bit on each of the three questions. I don't specifically look at ASEAN-India negotiations, and I'm also not in the trade section before in the Secretariat. But what I can see is that I'm actually seeing a lot of changes in ASEAN's mindset when it comes to, and willingness, to incorporate more things when it comes to trade negotiations. And I think Pasha mentioned two very interesting ones. One is ASEAN-Canada, because Canada and some of the Western countries are actually one of the most difficult to negotiate because they have a lot of standards. When we look at trade, we want to look at market access, right? And we want to talk about tariffs. But when they look at trade, they want to talk about environment, they want to talk about human rights standards, labor protection. And these are things that we don't have in place within ASEAN yet. So if you don't have in place within ASEAN, how do you negotiate with external partners? And EU is a very good example. The negotiation started very long ago. So it went on for like 9 years, and they set out the parameters, of the agreement, that they were going to have. But in the end, nothing worked out. So now they said that they will do bilateral FTAs and use it as a building block, towards a regional FTA. But I don't know how they do it because bilateral FTAs are very high standards. Just look at Singapore. You think Singapore FTA can become a building block for ASEAN's FTA that Laos and Cambodia and Myanmar can be part of? I'm not too sure. But at least a willingness to talk to Canada, the upgrade of UNSFATA. UNSFATA is the ASEAN-Australia, New Zealand FTA, upgrade of ASEAN-China FTA. I think all these upgrades speaks of ASEAN's willingness, to look further, into new areas that maybe we have not really much talked about before, even like IP, consumer protection, MSMEs. So I think we are on the right track. So that's all that I can say. And for the question on the diversifying, trade, Denise has talked about some very technical things about the supply chains, but I'll just say something about more general. And I don't know what is Australia's policy is, but I know ASEAN has a lot of trading partners. So RCEP, that 5 countries, including India, they are our trade partners. So we have 6 plus one, and Hong Kong as well, yeah. Actually, we also have Hong Kong now. Yes, Australia, yes. So the five RCEP partners plus India, which is not in RCEP yet, and some new ones coming up. So these are all part of our diversification. But I always feel that middle powers are easier, not very, but easier to work with than the major powers because of one thing. They believe in a rule-based order. They want to enforce multilateralism, which I talked about. They want to follow by the WTO rules. And I think these are very, very fundamental principles that are very important for ASEAN. So as long as they are willing to do that, they are considered as a like-minded partner. So that's why we will continue to explore. And there's actually more dialogue, sectorial dialogue partners coming in, right? So we had a proliferation of all these partners, and Turkey also wants to be a dialogue partner. So we could potentially see the future having some of these sectorial dialogue partners also having FTAs with ASEAN in the long run. And the question about a Trump policy, yeah, I totally agree with you. If you ask me, I'll be very honest and say, please don't try to do too many things. Because by the time you set up your factory in the US 3 years later, he's out of office, you know. So yes, because of all these changes, and actually fundamentally, we don't even know if the tariff is going to remain for long, right? Because of their own internal processes that are actually ongoing. So I would say that yes, we react, but don't overreact. Because if you overreact, you may overdo it and then something change again tomorrow. So very quickly on that, is it knowledge of ASEAN? You are talking about the knowledge of ASEAN and the soft skills. I think this is very important, ASEAN identity, right? It's something that the ASCC is looking at. And I think ASEAN needs to move beyond diplomatic construct, you know, to bring tangible benefits to people. And Denise mentioned about the ASEAN lane. We had it. There was a guidelines, agreements, everything was signed, but then the ASEAN lane didn't come in place. ASEAN decided to have an ASEAN lane. It was something that all 10 countries agreed. But what is the implementation of the ASEAN lane? You see in three countries, maybe 2 or 3 countries. That's about it. And then remember, we had this movement of the 8 professions, the free movement of professionals.
There is an APEC link, so that's why it's ASEAN.
So there's so because of the APEC, then people don't use ASEAN. I don't know. You know, but anyway, the free movement of the 8 professions, I don't really see a lot of progress on that either, right? So these are some of the things that are more people-centric, people-oriented, but find it very difficult to implement because you may have an agreement, but individual countries puts in some other rules, which is a bit like the non-tariff barriers of that, you know, people movement side. So there's a lot of work yet to be done. Yeah.
Can I just make one last point? I think it's related to your question about, well, why are you worried? Because, you know, Trump is only going to be president for 4 more years and then everything will change. Not necessarily so. Are there any Americans here? Yeah, I think you understand, right, that things have changed dramatically. The whole political psyche and everything has changed in the US. And there is a general belief that we've lost out, right? We've lost our jobs, we've lost good jobs, good paying jobs. But a lot of it is not to do with free trade agreements or open trade. A lot of it is to do with technology. I think there's been some studies that show that 70% of job losses are due to technology. And a lot of these policies of protectionism that you see in the US predates even Trump 2.0. Because even the Biden administration, whether it's the Inflation Reduction Act, other kinds of legislation, was protectionist in nature. So I believe that even once Trump leaves, many of these policies will continue in some form or another. Because I think the recognition is China is, whether you're a Democrat or Republican, China is a strategic competitor.
Thank you all for your detailed answers. Let's try to collect.
May I respond?
Very briefly, yes.
Well, simply use the energy to improve the intertrade amongst ASEAN and Southeast Asia. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Let's collect a second round of questions. Are there any more questions? Oh, yes, yes, please. Yes. Anulak.
Okay. Yeah, Anulak Kirikun. I'm just visiting here as a senior fellow at the KY School. Yeah, very fascinating presentations. I learned a lot. Just two questions. One question is, yeah, I think from Catherine's presentation, it's very optimistic that if you take ASEAN plus 3, it's a big market and big group, and our dependence on the US is going down further. But if you look deeper in each individual countries, especially the smaller countries such as Cambodia or Laos, the tariffs hit is very high. And of course, although these countries are quite close to China and has a deep economic relationship with China, they do try to, or they have been trying to diversify. And that's why you have seen during the past years that their trade in the US actually increased. And then you get hit by 50% tariffs. So my question is, who helped the little guys? I mean, obviously, like Dennis says, you call out Washington, nobody's picking up your call. So probably you would not be calling too often. And does ASEAN have a role? I mean, when Malaysian Prime Minister said we have to speak as ASEAN, but in fact, is that really happening, or is it just words? If you're familiar with the negotiation as a group, does it really happen? And does the ASEAN Secretariat have any role, or other ASEAN bodies, to champion the little guys? Otherwise, they will be drawn further and further to China, which they don't want to do, but they have no choice. The second question is, Professor Pasha used to work for the WTO. Is the WTO entertaining any sort of negotiation or mediation role with respect to these tariffs, or is it completely marginalized?
Thank you. Thank you, Anulak. Yes, let's collect maybe one final question. Over there, yes, please.
Hi, thank you so much for the engaging talk. I'm Elise from RSIS, and my question is this: so there's this call to turn towards ASEAN inter-region dependency, but this raises a concern for me. So it was mentioned earlier that countries who are harder hit by Trump's tariffs, like Laos, Cambodia, and Myanmar, to potentially turn to China instead. But this particular region has a history of illicit activity proliferated in the special economic zone. So my question is, in light of potential greater inter-regional dependency, are there any considerations being made for the proliferation of illicit economic activity, and how much of this will affect legitimate economies? Thank you.
Thank you very much. So we still have time for a few more questions. I saw, yes, please.
Hi, Ignatius from Shell. Interested to know in the area of work, what is the end game that you look at in this uncertain time? What kind of signal and signposts that you monitor in order to get an informed decision or thinking around where is the landing at some point, or is there even any of such scenario that you're thinking about? Thank you.
Thank you. Yes, Molly, please.
Hi, my name is Melly Anthony from RSIS. My question is to Catherine, because she really offers the wider perspective of a region response to the US. And very briefly discuss about the prospects, the space that the ASEAN plus 3 countries can work on given the uncertainties. But other than the one mentioned by Dennis about the current disputes that could affect whatever space that's available, I was wondering in your work and in your analysis, how do you see the other 3 countries, the plus 3, right? You have the Japan, you have Korea, and China. What more can they do to work with ASEAN in buffering the concerns, whether it's in tariff, and increasing trade, because Japan is also protectionist in its own right. And so what can these countries actually do? Because when we really think about economic security in Southeast Asia, you cannot but appreciate the fact that you're not only looking at ASEAN, it's really ASEAN and the wider East Asian region.
Thank you. So now we have to, for the interest of time, to give space to our panel to address the questions. So Catherine, there are 2 questions for you, so maybe you can start first.
Thank you very much, Barbara. To the first question, who helps the little guys, right? Just to understand the impact and who advocates for them. Sorry, I've been remiss in this. You're absolutely right that Cambodia, Laos, Vietnam are some of the most affected by the tariffs, and they're disproportionately affected. So just to clarify a few things, one, ASEAN does not negotiate as a group. The way Prime Minister Arnoa said it is just that they will come together and they would have a common stance. In that common stance is not to retaliate, but that they will negotiate. But in terms of negotiations, because it deals with the sovereignty of each country, countries actually go on their own. And Cambodia and Vietnam were actually one of the first to negotiate with the US right after the reciprocal tariffs were announced. And this was even prior to the 90-day pauses. Again, a clarification, ASEAN Secretariat do not explicitly help with the negotiation. They may help similar to ourselves, I would imagine, in terms of supporting them, in terms of analysis and assessment, but we do not have an active role similar to ASEAN Sec to actually support them. So what then can the little guys do, right? So some of the things that we, at least in terms of in our capacity, can help is also in providing the financial safety nets that are in place. So such as the CMIM. CMIM provides some form of financial support to support them if there is a balance of payments crisis, if necessary. Because in all this situation, you're always preparing for if a crisis were to hit any of your member economies, what can they do? What's the worst case scenario, right? The longer term development, the longer term trade in, diversification and all that, these are long-standing work that has to be pursued by various agencies and for various agencies, including and especially the private sector, to come together and actually push for. So on our end, at least as far as what we can do in terms of supporting and helping the little guys, is to ensure that global safety nets are in place and they are actionable and they are operational in case they are needed. We also maintain very close engagements with them. We have annual consultation with these countries, and they also meet at least twice a year at deputy ministers level. And the latest one was just at 8th of April in Kuala Lumpur. And the governors and the ministers for ASEAN and ASEAN Plus 3 actually do meet quite regularly. So this is in a way how, besides the political considerations and, our understanding of the political economy or the political issues and various issues pertaining to security and all sorts of other things, in terms of the financial cooperation for this region, the ASEAN Plus 3, it's actually quite a close one. And it's quite a regular one, and they are actually constantly in touch and, providing whatever support they can on that front. On the security front, unfortunately, I wouldn't be the best person to speak on that. For the last question on how the plus 3s and what they can do for the region. First of all, in terms of trade, there definitely are a much larger market for ASEAN economies, and ASEAN economies would leverage on them as a source of final demand. But secondly, the other area that we don't talk about enough is investment prospects. So they are home to a lot of the most innovative countries in the world, and especially, it started in the 1990s with Japan leading the way, with Korea catching up later on, and right now, the Chinese face that we have heard, throughout the hour from, Dennis and also Joanne. There's definitely a lot of high quality investments that has the potential to be exported to ASEAN economies, and that's potentially one area where they can work on. But lastly, and just as I mentioned earlier, this financial cooperation is something that doesn't get limelight a lot, but it's also equally important in that you ensure that there is a financial safety net in place so that if any of the ASEAN economies should need any financial support, they can leverage on the plus 3s to be able to, get themselves out of any crisis that they might potentially face. So these are things that are achieved through, besides the trade agreements and all that, there's also the financial cooperation, and that's also something that is where plus trees would play a big role for ASEAN. Thank you.
Thank you, Catherine. So, Pasha, there was one question for you.
Sure. So let me address WTO issues. The role of WTO in negotiating tariff matters. The short answer is limited or even none. Okay. Having said that, WTO does have this resettlement mechanism. A lot of countries use the mechanism not to win the case, but to oblige the other party to engage in consultation. So I force you to talk, right? But so far, none of ASEAN countries have utilized the system. So in terms of one point that Catherine mentioned, an ASEAN plus one FTA, when we talk about ASEAN plus one FTA, it's not just one FTA. For example, ASEAN-China FTA is actually a combination of 10 FTA, right? Because we are not like EU, the ASEAN does not have treaty-making power. So it's just a document that includes 10 sets of FTA. So this is the difference between ASEAN and EU.
Thank you, Pasha. Dennis and Joanne, do you have any take on the last question?
Maybe I'll try to tackle your question is very tough because what is the end game, right? We don't know what the end game is. Are we heading towards a global recession? Is there going to be a global financial crisis? We don't know. I mean, I know that Catherine and her team will be tracking various different kinds of indicators, financial, economic indicators. But what I can say is that the region does have agency. We talked about it here. We talked about different kinds of regional framework with that. On the finance side, the ASEAN plus 3 finance ministers have been talking for years, right? There's a certain level of trust among them in exchange of information to see how we can improve, whether it's the Chiang Mai initiatives or other kinds of framework. RCEP, I mean, it's the first time you have China, Japan, Korea sitting together and agreeing on a free trade agreement because of ASEAN, right? You have that framework there. Other kinds of framework. Even the various ASEAN agreements we talked about, Joanne has talked about, they're there to try to facilitate greater trade investments, not just with the US or China, but among ASEAN companies, right? So you talked about why our intra-regional trade is only 20-22%. You're right. We should find ways to increase the level of trade investment among our companies. We do have agency. We just need to work at it. Right. Thank you.
Joanne?
So quickly touch on 2 points. One is the illicit, activities that are going on in some countries. Like I would suppose that these are 2 things, right? Cyber scam and drugs trafficking, and especially when we are looking at Cambodia, Laos, and Myanmar. So, I mean, this is actually a very serious issue that is being looked at by, I would say, a few bodies. One is the ASEAN Ministerial Meeting on Transnational Crime, and of course supported by the SOMTC, the Senior Official Meeting on Transnational Crime, and also the ASEAN Ministerial Meeting on Drugs. So these are under the APSC pillar. And I know that ADMM, the ASEAN Defense Ministerial Meeting Plus, and that also includes some of the dialogue partners, they might come up with a statement, or they have already come up with a statement on this cyber security. So I think this is actually something that is very real. But of course, to tackle that, we might need some countries that are outside the region to come in as well, like China. I think China has done its own things by itself, especially in Myanmar. It has actually stepped in to help themselves solve their own problem in regards to the cyber scam, by even working with the military junta and also working with some of the ethnic arms organizations that are controlling some of the regions where these sort of cyber activities that are happening. But of course, I think that rather than leaving it to China to handle, ASEAN can definitely do more. But then I found there's one question on the tariffs that's actually quite interesting. Like, what can ASEAN do, right, to help to all these smaller countries to negotiate? And I mentioned earlier that Prime Minister Anwar has actually requested for the ASEAN-US summit. But I want to be very honest here. Even within Southeast Asia countries themselves, I mean, within this region itself, a lot of people do not know how to approach it. Because I mean, usually we will go to the US trade representative, right, when we want to talk about tariffs. But for some reason, the Commerce Secretary is also involved. The Treasury Secretary is also involved. And once in a while, Trump sits into this meeting himself. So do you go to the USTR first? Do you go to the Commerce Secretary? Do you go to the Treasury Secretary? Is there a pecking order? Who can help you more? I mean, there's always this kind of a very, very difficult question to ask. And I feel that the US itself, I'm sorry for our friend from the US, is a little bit in a mess. Because, you know, sometimes I feel that they do not even know what is the end game as well. Like, you know, do they have a procedure for ASEAN countries to use? And what channel do we go to? And then a lot of people are out of office as well. They are put on forced leave because a lot of organizations aren't really fully functioning right now. So this is the issue. But I just want to say one last thing is that ASEAN as an organization, and especially if you think you want to rely on the ASEAN Secretariat, it's probably not going to happen. You know, we are not the European Commission, and it's based on consensus building. So we have the ASEAN Economic AEC Council, right? And of course the leaders, and they will task a lot of things to the junior officers and also the Secretariat. But the Secretariat has very little resources and they have no enforcement power. So if you think that you can use the Secretariat to champion all these things, well, it's definitely not going to happen. But I always feel that under the ASEAN Vision 2045, institutional strengthening should be a very, very core goals of it. If you even want to deepen economic integrations, at least somebody needs to monitor and help with the implementation. Thank you.
Thank you very much. That was a very thought-provoking 90 minutes. So what emerges clearly is that ASEAN's economic security will depend on its ability to balance external pressures with internal coordination, leveraging both existing strengths and new strategic approaches. With that, first of all, I'd like to thank the panel for their time. And also, I'd like to thank the audience for coming over and being practically engaged with your questions. I wish everyone a great evening ahead. Thank you.